We continue our series from the book of Hebrews. We're up to Hebrews 12. Now it's interesting, in this letter, the write-up of this letter never actually says what his name is. Now in the early church, from about 400 AD through to when the Protestant movement happened in the 1600 AD, the letters would quite often be written by the Apostle Paul. Now Paul's name is not mentioned. And if you look at Hebrews chapter 2 verse 3, it says, he writes there, "This salvation which we first announced by the Lord was confirmed to us by those who heard him." So in other words, the writer of Hebrews is not actually an eyewitness of Jesus, and he's also not someone who received a special revelation, which Paul would have mentioned if it was him who wrote the letter. So we don't know who wrote the letter, but he was obviously someone who was well loved and well respected by the early church. Now the second thing is you think, well, when was the letter written? Now it appears it would have been definitely written before the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. Why is this? The author, because he's talking about the whole Jewish faith, if the temple had been destroyed, it would be logical in those sections on the temple that he talks about in Hebrews, that he would have mentioned the fact that the temple had been destroyed. So he leaves that part out. And secondly, whenever he talks about the priests or the sacrificial system or anything to do with the temple, he talks about them in the present tense. Now, of course, they've been destroyed. You would have talked about them in the past tense. And so we can sense it to be before AD 70. Why is this so special? Because the writer is most likely writing at a time when Christians were facing persecution. And persecution came from two sources. The first was by Jews. And it's interesting, as you read through the book of Acts, you find the Apostle Paul spends his whole life being arrested because the Jews would incite riots against him. And so the Jews were the first and foremost. And so if you were a Jewish person who became a Christian, there would be massive pressure by your family to swap back to being Jewish. Now, in my research, I've realised that we average about one Jewish rabbi every 10 years somewhere in the world becomes a Christian. Now, one of those ones in more recent times was a Jewish rabbi down in Melbourne. And so he struggles through the whole issue of who is Jesus, and he finally makes up his mind that Jesus is the Messiah, the chosen one that the Jewish faith looked forward to. And he tells the eldership of his synagogue. He is sacked on the spot, told to move out of his house on the spot. They ring up the network of Jewish people in Melbourne and say, he's anathema, do not speak to him. So suddenly, no job, no house, no friends, all his network is pulled from around him, and he very nervously rings up his mother and explains to her he's become a Christian. Now, if you're a good Jewish mother, the worst thing could happen is that your boy swaps. And she gives him one piece of advice. Talk to your brother in Canada about what you have done. So there's no reason to stay in Melbourne, so he flies from Melbourne to Canada, and he sits down with his brother very, very nervously and very carefully thinking, will his brother beat him up or what will happen? And he says, I have become a Christian. And his brother responds, praise God. He'd become a Christian years earlier. But his mother had said to his brother, do not tell your brother, he's a rabbi. He will be so upset. And so he'd been silent about his conversion. But you imagine the struggle that these two boys went through when they became Christians. And the writer of Hebrews would have been the best book to give to these two men to say, we know what you are going through. Because the whole book of Hebrews touches on the struggle of coming to salvation faith. And I imagine for a lot of people, when they swap religions, it can be devastating. For some people, they think, well, I've gone from being Roman Catholic to Protestant. In some sense, it's seen as a minor step. But those who've done it see it as a whirlwind, because you go from this mindset thinking, I am saved by my works, to I am saved by God's grace and mercy. That's a very, very powerful story. So the whole book of Hebrews is very much written to these people who are struggling. So the first groups were the Jews that picked on them. The second group would have been the Romans. Now, a lot of the times the Jews would have incited the Romans to riot, and so there was these struggles. So as we come to chapter 12 and chapter 13, they're very much written to people saying, I know the troubles you're going through. I've given you a whole lot of theology, but I also want to encourage you to hang in there no matter what happens. So what have we seen so far in the book of Hebrews? We've seen that Jesus is greater than Moses, who was the greatest man that most Jews would have looked at, who is greater than King David, who is greater than Abraham. That Jesus was greater than the prophets, and in chapter 11 that Phil looked at last week, all the great men of faith, that Jesus was greater than all of them. So that's the first thing Hebrews has told us. The second thing is that Hebrews said worship has been transformed. There's no longer priests, no longer tabernacles, no longer temples, no longer sacrifice, no longer worship days, no longer Sabbath, because all of these are just a shadow, and Jesus is the reality that we hold on to. Why is this? Because Jesus changes everything. It's a total mindset shift when we put Christ in the centre of our life. And it's interesting, if we go to chapter 12 and verse 18, the second part of our reading that Stephen gave us today picks up a number of the theological themes of the Old Testament and touches how they have been impacted by Jesus. So there in verse 18, for you have not come to what may not be touched, a blazing fire and darkness and gloom and a tempest. Now the first part, of course, is the idea of Moses going onto the holy mountain, and the sound of a trumpet and the voices whose words make the hearers beg that no further messages be spoken to them. So when Moses was spoken to by God, it scared the living daylights out of the Jewish people. Then in verse 20, for they could not endure the order that was given, for even if a beast touches the mountain, it shall be stoned. Why? Because there was a sense of holiness that was happening in front of their eyes. Then in verse 21, indeed, so terrified was the sight that Moses said, I tremble in fear. So there's this sense that God came down to speak to them, and people were aware of the presence of God. Then in verse 22, for you have not come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to innumerable angels in festival gathering, and to the assembly of the firstborn who enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and to the spirits of the righteous made perfect. So there's a sense of saying, when Jesus came to earth, God came to earth. He did not come to judge the world, but Jesus came to save the world. That's why you and I as Christians can confidently talk to God with no sense of fear. Because God says your past sins are forgiven, your present sins are forgiven, your future sins are forgiven. You are part of my family. I love you. I've empowered you with my Holy Spirit to transform you. Everything has changed. And so we go back to the very beginning of Hebrews 12, and he wants to encourage these Christians who are struggling. And he says this, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses. In other words, you've heard about Moses and David and the prophets and all these faithful people. They are there because you are running the same race they are. You are running beside them. He goes on to say about sin. Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. And that takes a sense of examination of ourselves. Now, it's quite a few years since I first became a fanatical bike rider. And in my first 3 months, I managed to lose about 25 to 30 kilos in weight from bike riding. In fact, I lent my first bike to a friend of mine that he gave it back to me about a couple of weeks ago and took it out for a ride. I thought, this feels so funny compared to my racing bike. Now, when I first got my racing bike, I was fanatical because everybody said, you've got to get rid of all the weight off your bike. So I thought, reflectors, I'll get rid of them because they weigh at least 10 grams. I got rid of my drink bottle because I think, well, who wants to carry a kilo of drink in their bottle? I can stop at the car and get a drink. And I looked at every single thing on my bike thinking, what can I remove? Now, I was fanatical, but there are others who are far more fanatical than me. They go to the shops and say, oh, if I buy this pedal, I will save 4 grams in weight. And you go down the shops, and a couple of weeks back when I was at the bike shop, for $7,000, I could buy a bike that would weigh next to nothing. As a matter of fact, it's so light, it's actually illegal to use as a racing bike. And I'm thinking, who would buy a bike like this? Someone who's fanatical about riding. You and I need to be fanatical about sin. If I went to that much effort to make my bike lighter, how much effort should you and I go to make our life holy and sin lighter? Now, it's interesting, years ago I realised that computer games added absolutely nothing to my life. And I made a very conscious decision that I'd delete all the games off my computer. That was years ago now. I don't play computer games at all. I don't think I have lost anything from giving up computer games. I know other people will be horrified that I've done that, and if I tell some people, they have a massive argument and try to give me good reasons why I should keep on playing. But I've lost nothing. You lose nothing when you get rid of sin from your life. Some sins are addictive, some are exciting, some give you great pleasure, but they are nothing to lose them from your life. And the writer of Hebrews wants to say to these people, persevere, be holy, be passionate, be gospel-centred. The second thing is, he knows as they're struggling, that there's a sense of hanging in there in the hard times. So our second sentence or heading is called endurance. So there in chapter 12, verse 1, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Then in verse 3, consider him who endures from sinners such hostility against himself, so that we may not grow weary or faint-hearted. Then in verse 4, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your own blood. There's a couple of things that teaches us about Jesus. The first is Jesus gives an example that we can be encouraged by, that we can ponder on his suffering and realise that it's relevant to our own suffering and our own desire to walk in his steps. Then in chapter 12, verse 12, it says, therefore lift your drooping hands, strengthen your weak knees, and make straight paths for your feet, so that what is lame may not be put out of joint, but rather be healed. God basically says, hang in there, persevere, run the race, run with endurance, because the end of the race is far more satisfying than the beginning of the race. And so we as Christians are told to hang in there and persevere. The third key thing that comes out of Hebrews chapter 12 is, who is Jesus in this whole story? The whole way, there's a sense that Jesus is greater than all these people. Jesus is greater than all these religious stuff. But what does it say about Jesus? There in chapter 12, verse 2. Look to Jesus. He's the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne. Then in chapter 12, verse 24. Jesus is the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkling blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. So in this section of Hebrews, he explores and defines a life of faith. He's reached and become perfection that you and I, as sinners, will never reach. But we're told to run the race. Secondly, Jesus' life is a pattern for you and I to copy. Thirdly, it is a motivation. It says that the joy set before him, his anticipation of the glory with the Father. What is our most motivation? It should be heavenly motivation. There's a sense that this world is not our home, and what God has in store for us will far outweigh what is happening. Every so often, have you ever heard the saying, that person so heavenly minded is of no earthly good? I actually find it quite stupid, because if you're truly heavenly minded, you are of the most earthly good. It was highly heavenly minded men who spent decades saying, stop slavery, in a world where nobody thought slaves were wrong. What motivated them? Their gospel-hearted passion to serve Jesus. It also tells us about endurance. For Jesus, endurance was the cross and its shame. We have not yet reached that point of our struggle. But it also tells us that you and I should be motivated by triumph. Why? Because Jesus sits now at the right-hand side of authority beside his Father. And he'll call us into heaven, into that sense of authority. Now the writer of Hebrews then turns from trying to encourage these Christians who are struggling to talk about discipline. And I don't know anyone who says, oh gee, I like being disciplined, unless they've got problems. But it talks now about godly discipline and it gives us a couple of things. The first, it says that discipline is important. So there in chapter 12, verse 5. Have you forgotten the exhortation that addressed you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when approved by him. In other words, we need to take account. When God wants to speak to us and convict us, there's a good reason for us to listen. And the first thing is that when God disciplines us, he disciplines us from a deep sense of love. There in verse 6, for the Lord disciplines the one he loves and chastises his own son whom he receives. Now, as you know, Jean and I fostered 23 kids in our early part of our marriage. It's a whole generation ago. One of those young boys we adopted. And once he did a really, really bad thing, which I won't talk about now, but he deserved to be spanked. And it was the only time I ever spanked him in his whole life. And of course, as I spanked him, there's tears pouring down my face. I'm thinking, I don't want to spank my son. I was thinking I'd like to be spanked, not him. And after this big hug and whatever, and we prayed together, and he said, Dad, gee, you love me? Because a father disciplines a son with love. The third thing it talks about is discipline strengthens us. Because it said there in verse 7, the discipline that you may endure, it helps us in our struggle. And the fourth thing it says that discipline is the response of a truly loving father to his son. It says that God is treating you as sons, but what son is there whom the father does not discipline? If you're left without discipline in which you are being participated, you are an illegitimate child and not sons. Besides this, we have had earthly fathers who disciplined us and we respected them. Shall we not much more be subject to the Father of Spirit and live? And so there's a sense that we need to come under boundaries. I don't know from teaching in class, if you're a strict teacher, the kids feel safe in your class. And I've gone past classes at school and I was horrified. The kids be yelling and screaming and walking around and chatting to each other. I'm thinking, where's the teacher? And I look in the room a bit closer and realise the teacher's at the front of the class and teaching away and the kids aren't listening. You think, my gosh, how scary is this? The next thing is that discipline is there for benefit. In other words, there's a blessing that comes from being disciplined. Verse 10, for they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them. But he disciplined us for our good, that we may share his holiness. And the last part of this here is that discipline has good long-term outcomes. For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant. How true is that? But later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. As we become obedient to God, the difference it makes. I love my morning swims because you have all the people bring their dogs down. And there was one lady this morning, she had the only lady who did not have her dog on a lead. And her dog was faithfully about a metre behind her, faithfully walking wherever she went. The dog followed her. I thought, how obedient a dog is that? There's other dogs that are on the edge of a long lead and they're panting to get away from their master. And you know if you let them off, they'll run down the beach and that's it. And you'll see some people let their dog off and they're calling the dog, come here dog, come here dog. And the dog's just running around doing its own thing. Absolutely no discipline whatsoever. Now, if that dog is running beside a dangerous road and the owner is saying, come dog, the owner is in fear the dog's going to be hit by a car, but the dog couldn't care less. It has no idea what's going to happen to it. And that's the same with us in discipline. Discipline has a long-term consequence. And there are times that God will be doing a work in our life that we may not like, but it's for our love, for our holiness, for our growth, and for our maturity. He then, in this last part of chapter 12, he wants to just grab snippets to encourage them. So the first snippet is this, verse 14. It talks about peace. Strive for peace with everyone and for holiness without which no one will see the Lord. So in other words, we're told just to be loving with people. Now it's funny, the type of humour that some people have. A friend of mine who is a lecturer in theology over in America, he said, I'd be happy to agree with you, but there's no point both of us being wrong. I like his dry humour saying that. But there are times that, have you ever been told if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all? And your mother says, why aren't you speaking? She says, because I'm obeying you. And there are times it is a struggle, but we are called to be gracious people. And we can come across some people who are phenomenally difficult. And one of the ways you can break down a phenomenally difficult person is by being gracious with them. They may never have had anyone be gracious with them before. Now the second thing after peace is that the whole thing of grace. There in verse 15. See to it that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it many have been defiled. Do not hold on to sin. Do not hold on to bad things. Do not hold on to trouble. And the third area is that of sexual purity, which was a big thing in the writer of Hebrews' time and a big thing in our modern times. Verse 16, that no one is sexually immoral or unholy like Esau, who sold his birthright for a single meal. It is sad when people do something stupid that can destroy a marriage, can destroy a career, can destroy a family. And sometimes it's the most minor of stupid petty things that has caused this trouble. He finishes with these words in verse 28. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And then let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. If you were Jewish at the time when this letter was written, it may have been quite close to the destruction of Jerusalem. Very good chances would have been written while the Jewish war was happening and your whole world was being shaken. If you lived in Israel, you lived under fear of thinking, do I stay in Jerusalem when Jesus says don't stay in Jerusalem? And if you've left Jerusalem, you've got people saying you're a turncoat, why aren't you, loving your country and whatever? And you imagine the struggles they were going through. But it says here, your kingdom cannot be shaken. And what is our response? Let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe. There's a sense that when we come together to worship, there's a part of our time is praying to a God who loves us. Part of our time is hearing God's word through Bible readings and through sermons. And part of our time is to give him praise in our songs. And I must say, I love the songs that Helen picks. I'm thinking the songs have so much theology in them that if we had no sermon, you still have been taught by what we have sung. Because that's what the older hymn writers would do. They'd want to teach you good theology. So why do we come together as a church? We come to hear God's word. We come to pray to a loving Father. We come to worship him and then fellowship. That's why after church is as important as church. Because we are family. We are the people of God. We're called to serve him and love him. And when his first words were written by the writer of Hebrews, he wanted to encourage Christians who were in struggle time, who were in difficulties. Have you ever had people say to you, why do you bother going to church? Isn't there better things you can do on a Sunday morning? And the answer is no. What could be greater than worshipping the living God of the universe? Let's finish in prayer. Father God, we thank you that you love us. You've saved us through Jesus. You transform us by your Holy Spirit. And we take these words from Hebrews 12 as an encouragement for us to persevere, to be willing to be convicted by your Spirit, and to be holy as you are holy. Amen.